And we've got some real honoured, some special guests here tonight who've done a huge journey across the country and understanding the nature of the breadth of this country. And we also have a bunch of people who've travelled across Pittwater. And on a wildlife moment, I don't think that's to be underestimated. So one of them is, probably needs no introduction, but I think Rick is going to introduce our speaker tonight, Craig. But can I just say to you guys, thank you for coming. It's a real special thing for us to have all of you here, to have everybody of the Northern Beaches architectural community in one place is really cool.
I've known this fella for a big long time, and we've worked together for 50 years.
50 years.
Long time. And he's I think besides the wonderful sort of incredibly varied blackfellow cultures of this country who are just so amazing, outside of that ethos and almost within that ethos, I think Craig Burton has the best sense for how this country operates on almost any scale. And I've come to know over those 50 years just how important that is. And Stutchy, who's kicking around here somewhere, and I were told by Lloyd Rees, our great painter, at one stage, that yes, they are an amazing people, our original cultures, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it was this land that made them that way in the first place. And you remember when he told that to us, Dutch, like it shook us both. Because how on earth can a person who's probably the greatest whitefellow landscape painter the country's ever had, how can he see so clearly to go back hundreds of thousands of years, well before any civilisations here, and say, that's the issue? And as architects, it becomes very clear that that's the issue, and it's hard for us to understand that. Craig understands it brilliantly. And so, on all those sorts of levels that come before architecture, landscape, land, learned German, landscape, Schiff, scope, landscope is what it's actually about. Not about gardening. Gardening, kindergarten, the guarding of the children. It means to guard. Landscope is the landscape is the scope of the land. And that is so fundamental, and it underpins so many of our great cities, why that city started there in the first place. It just is what we need to understand is the sort of the heartbeat of a place before we start thinking about what we can do with it, or in our case in this culture, what we do to it. And if you think about somehow as a great tapestry of underlying layers, and that each of them has connections to the next, and when some part is injured, then things have to be repaired. If you're doing work in a city, if you don't understand the tapestry of a city, how it's made, how can you make the changes to it which belong there? Long time being. That's why it's so important before we start any drawing things at all. Craig, on the other hand, he's a designer, architect, heritage architect. He understands the game, if you like, on all levels. And he's been living on Pittwater almost or longer than me, maybe.
About the same time.
About the same time. And
53 years.
yeah, and our connections through, I think your mother's side is French Huguenot.
French Huguenot, yeah. Friend of the Pastriers from Ashfield.
That's right.
Yep.
Amazing. So we've got great connections. What a pleasure it is to introduce you tonight, my friend, and thanks for doing it.
What I wanted to talk about was something quite personal, like a personal history of things, rather than an academic. So we have Pittwater, between two peninsulas, the Lambert Peninsula and then the Barrenjoey Peninsula, running north-south. And I'm sort of interested in, as Richard mentioned, so I'm interested in the layers of history. And so then that's where I become involved in heritage, but heritage becomes a sort of stultified thing, but it should be something that's more organic. And you really just sort of, it's a way of understanding places. And so I thought to talk about the layers of Pittwater, and it's both the physical layers and the human layers. So a little bit in what Richard touched on and how these things are so interconnected and moving together. You can almost take this anywhere else, because I always tell students that any landscape is a cultural phenomena. The idea of landscape is a cultural thing, and that it involves people primarily and their perception and experience of geology and climate. And the climate's dynamic. The geology has been with us for a long time. So in Pittwater we have the Permian period and the Triassic period. And I won't get too technical, but the Permian's 299 million years old, the Triassic's 251 million years old. So it's just the other day. And those things don't change much. And so we have where we are in Sydney, and Pittwater is at the post-glacial edge of the Sydney Basin. And it's a series of depositional sediments. Humans have responded to those depositional sediments and made their own depositions. So a bit like Lloyd Rees, that landscapes inspire people to do things, to make things. And so it actually forms the people, and then the people make the landscapes themselves. So it's a two-way kind of process. And it's sort of understanding that nothing's really sacred except the continuity of forces moving between things. And so the humans, the indigenous humans, the First Nations people, have understood the land, the fresh water, the salt water, the atmosphere, the cosmos. And everything moves together, and everything is a reflection of one thing as another and influences each other. Different humans have occupied the same space, and that's a problem, and which we quite haven't sorted out. The Barrenjoey Peninsula is heavily developed. It's got some pathological disease called Western civilization. And then the western side is the Lambert Peninsula, and that was someone's image of trying to conserve nature, whatever that is. Because there's the nature of humans is all different. And this is an image, a painting by Adrian Faint in Palm Beach, which is looking westward into Pittwater. And I sort of like that image. In 1942, and it's definitely Western people of occupying the eastern side, which is what's happened historically, and they're taking advantage of the naturalness of the views, the quality of the light on the water, and the framing through the trees. And these look like angophores, and they probably are, but they may be spotted gums. They're two trees that are good at coastal environment here. And then this is a drawing that I was doing the other year to look at the different catchments we have and the nature of the place. So, but I won't dwell on this too much, but there's kind of an overview of understanding the physicality. So one starts with the geology, then with the climate, and then with the humans that have occupied it. And how has that nature influenced the human response in what to do there? And the human interest has gone through what I call 3 or 4 different periods or eras. And the first era is the first people, the indigenous people. And I should have said that I should have recognised that to all of us that we're on Darug country and the Garigal clan, perhaps, because it was only Governor Phillip that sat in a cave with an old man who was fishing on a rainy night like it is tonight in 1788, and he said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Garigal." So this has become Garigal, but it could be something else. We don't really know. Nobody really knows. We need to do a lot of truth-telling to understand a lot more. We don't hardly know anything. So everything is just a beginning and a process, which becomes quite exciting as you get and you work through it. The Garigal is a catchment of Pittwater. Human interest from First Nations people is a spiritual one, where everything is interconnected. And there is a spiritual association with every living thing and its relationship to each other. In what we would call in the Western sense ecology, but that's a very dumb word for everything that works together. And so the next era was the scenic. So with Westerners coming and colonisers coming, the British coming and colonising the place, they relished the scenic opportunities of Pittwater and other places, of course, in Australia. But this is a 1920s image which shows this ripe place for development, the Barrenjoey Peninsula, because you've got the ocean on one side and the lake on the other, which was, Pittwater was known as the lake, because its energy was quieter generally than the sea. They developed a kind of scenic appreciation which was aesthetic. It's an aesthetic understanding of the place, we would sometimes relate to landscape, in that it's enclosed by both peninsulas. If you're on the eastern side of the Barrenjoey Peninsula, you're looking out to sea and taking in the energy of the ocean. If in Pittwater, it's kind of semi-enclosed to partially enclosed to fully enclosed in some places. So it's spatially different, but it has aesthetic, scenic potential. And that's very much the 19th century. And then the third human interest has been materialism, which is seeing the land and the water as commodities. And that led to our present condition of real estate values. And so we start developing things, we start destroying things for perceived quantities of money. And then that's quite a different thing to the spiritual. We're moving away from that. This is something that I did in 1988, 89 when I worked on the heritage study for Pittwater to succeed from Warringahshire. And now we've gone backwards, we've gone into northern beaches. We've become lost. And we need to come back. But that was my drawing, but this is the real drawing of the geological structure. And the darker blue areas are Narrabeen. The lighter blue is Hawkesbury sandstone. So I talked before about the layers of the geology, very important. Very important to First Nations people, should be very important to us. But not everyone in Pittwater would understand what I'm talking about when I say, oh, you're on the edge of the Narrabeen and the Hawkesbury. And they go, what? right? And then, so there are these layers, these sedimentary layers of the Sydney Basin. So the bottom is the granite, then there's the coal measures on top of that, then there's the Shoalhaven series, then there's the Narrabeen series. And most of Pittwater and the Northern Beaches is in the Narrabeen. And then on top of that is this Hawkesbury sandstone. It's about 300 metres thick. And on top of that is the Wayanamatta. The Wayanamatta has eroded and gone to New Zealand in Pittwater, and we have the Hawkesbury and the Narrabeen. So that's 251 million years ago. And then people have arrived since. Well, some people have always been here, as they say. And then they respond to things differently. They have a different interest in things. And I think that we have to learn to have the same interest as the First Nations people in order to understand things properly. And that would go for the rest of Australia. That would go for Darwin as well as for Pittwater. The First Nations cultures are related to catchments. So this is the Garrigal catchment, which is the drainage catchment coming into Pittwater. And so here you have Narrabeen, which is Maragul, and then here you have Manly and Sydney Harbour, and then up here it's all the post-glacial situation. So which is 8 to 10,000 years and ago. But before that, I'm sure there were different cultures here. So it's more complex than what we really know about. So we can only talk about the last 10,000 years. The catchments are very important, I think, because this is national park, so it's not divided, but I've divided them up here through the peninsula, which is mostly occupied by residential development and some spots of urbanity or pseudo-urbanity. And the council and the government would have us totally urban. And in fact, when I gave a similar talk about the Pittwater Forum from the New South Wales government's concern that they wanted to make the whole thing urban. It was all coloured in urban because it was designed in Houston, Texas, from some American real estate developers that our council paid for, but didn't ask any of us. And so this can be the problem. The national park seems okay, but for now. This is a sort of 1950s sketch of this part of the east coast. So we have Pittwater here, Scotland Island where I am, and Lion Island up here. And then this is the post-glacial position. So you have a series of islands with a lot of sedimentary material that is weathered down between because of different climates through freshwater drainage. And there are issues. This is Avalon, which floods, and this is Newport, Mona Vale. There's a series of wetlands, and the British call them swamps, and swamps you don't go near. Swamps are things to drain because you'll get some sort of miasmic sort of disease. This is the study we did in 1989 for Pittwater to succeed for Warringah, the heritage study. So that's when I started thinking about it, and I haven't stopped thinking about it and worrying about it. And then I thought, during that study, I listed this tree as the most significant tree on where I live in Scotland Island, and I think it's probably the most significant tree on the eastern coast of Australia. And that was the original tree. So I listed it with the council as a heritage tree. The next week they came out with a chainsaw and cut it down. And so what's happened here now, it's starting to grow back. It's got a very powerful force. And this tree has been planted by Indigenous people, and it's possibly 8,000 years old. It's the biggest one I've ever come across in Australia. And it's growing on a midden. And it represents the female spirit. The female spirit is the one who protects all humanity. It doesn't matter whether you're First Nations or someone from another planet like England or Northern Hemisphere. So that's very inclusive. But the Western way is not to be inclusive. This is mine now, we're taking it. We'll cut it down. But it's got a force. It was a huge tree, you can see by the trunk. Every part of the tree is usable. I'm supposed to be writing a book about this tree, but so excuse me if I don't talk about it, if I don't stop talking about it for the next 2 hours. But the most important thing is it's the female spirit, the protector of all humanity, and it marks very safe places in our environment. And I've been recording them all over Eastern Australia. And this only grows, this is part of the ancient rainforests that are over 360 million years old. But they're planted by Indigenous people. And every part of this tree is useful to humans, and particularly for fishing and fabric and a whole lot of things. I don't need to go on too long about it, but I could bore you senseless about all the details associated with this tree. And it just happened to be kind of where I'm living. So it was pretty exciting. And I've recorded all of these trees all up and down the east coast on song lines. And they go back into the central Australia. And they tell a story. And this is the biggest one I've ever come across. So I was quite excited by that. And that was the result of the heritage study. And nobody wanted to know about it, particularly the council. And then just to touch a bit on the Indigenous background, that this is a map of Lieutenant Ball and Lieutenant Dawes from the colony. Walking from across here to north to Manly, and then coming up through the peninsula, the Barrenjoey Peninsula. And here, it's a very obscured, but it says, everywhere it says sandy and rocky, very rocky. They were looking for some sort of pastoral empire, and with their European brain, you know. And then they got to Newport, and it says, good pastures for sheep. And if you know Newport and Bilgola today, those of you that know, you think, sheep? Well, when you go back, you find that there were vast areas of cultivated areas burnt for grasses to encourage native grasses. And so these guys were walking through in 1792 into these huge grassed areas where the bush had been cleared. So it's a case of the humans making the landscape. And there's lots of examples. I could bore you senseless with these early watercolours of Pittwater. This is from Newport into Pittwater. You can see the green grass. The forest has been eliminated. And this is Mona Vale Beach. The swimming pool's here. But you can see the grass is coming through. The vegetation has been cleared, and we'd get upset about that today. But they clearly had a way of managing, and that's been spelt out by different people at different times. And then, of course, the most latest book is The Greatest Estate on Earth by Bill Gammage, but he just ripped off a woman's work from the 1960s, which is almost exactly the same. And I'm very upset about that. It's very clear that First Nations people managed the landscape, managed the environment in a very positive way, but to some of us it's a very disruptive way. But I mean, it's good enough for sheep. They must have got excited when they saw the green pastures. Went through all that rocky and sandy country and then saw green grass. My God. Things aren't so bad. So the problem is we have this now from the late 18th century through to the early 19th century. Here we have land grants. So the place is subdivided up cadastrally into allotments and given to people through graft and corruption and through genuine purchases. And Sydney is built on graft and corruption, and that's always been its nature. It always will be, I think, in the Western sense. One of the processes of me looking at the heritage in the 1980s was there were two very important things to my mind, and I did this poster. So I just used some of the images from the study so that I was concerned about determining the visually significant areas of Pittwater. The importance was about trees and tree cover and the landscape character and naturalness. So if I was going to define it, the slopes, what you see from the waterplane, what you see from public spaces, from roads, what you see from the ocean, is that those places could then be controlled under a development control plan in some way, that the local council could adopt it. Never been adopted. And the idea was that you conserve a proportion of the indigenous plants, you conserve a percentage of the canopy, and to retain the character, and that any development that occurs within that canopy be subject to having extended eaves and shadow lines and not solid masses and so forth, but so that any buildings would dissolve themselves into the forest. So, so that the visual impact was less. No one has adopted it to the present day. The other thing that I did was also then identify the waterplane of Pittwater as a heritage item, and then no one could cope with that either. I did a similar thing at Manly. I did the heritage study at Manly. I did a similar thing. They couldn't cope with that either. So then to control it, that quality of the water, so that now we're getting people coming in. During COVID, we've got Brexit refugees, we've got American refugees, we've got Trump refugees, we've got people from the eastern suburbs, heaven forbid, and then they're buying bigger chainsaws, and so they're cutting things down in the real estate mentality to see the water. But in the water, the maritime people are putting more moorings, and eventually there'll be no water. But so my intention was to save the water and save the forests and save the slopes to keep the character of the place, that is the landscape character, and still have the development, but it'd be sensitive development. And I think that's kind of where you come in, but none of it's happened. And this was a little sketch I did from my place, which again you see through the tree canopy. Now my neighbours have taken out all of these trees except one to date, and there's more boats there now than there were when I drew this. It was just a quick sketch, but and that's up to Longnose Point. So aluminium masts are replacing the timber trunks of the trees, and eventually I don't know what's going to happen. So that's still of concern. And so historically, I'm going back now a little bit to Church Point in the 1890s as a landing place very early on, earlier than that. Some of the first development, the shelter on the jetty, the ferry jetty and the landing place. And then I thought we'll just go over to the Western Shores. This is Mr. Harley's house, which was built in 1899 on the previous Oliver estate. And I could go into detail, but essentially this is the Burnie lookout within the national park now. And this chap's looking back at the Newport Hotel, which is now the Newport Arms. And so they used to run ferries from up into Lovett Bay, and then you'd have tea and scones and things down in Lovett Bay, and there's sheds, and then you'd walk up the zigzag to the lookout and look back to where you came from. So that's been an important kind of visual structure. But this is Rick in 1900 rowing over to Lovett Bay. And I used this image before in the Pittwater Forum as well, but this is 1900, exactly, because this building is the Red House, which is now known as Trincomalee. It's had 3 different names and 4 different owners. It was built in 1891 and part of the subdivision. And this is part of then the materialistic period where the real estate gets in. You've got the larger estates which were agricultural. There was attempted farming for wheat, and then there was a lot of horticultural production, citrus growing trees, and then in the case of the outer Lovett, you can just see Mr. Sharve's house here. William Sharve is another Frenchman, and in partnership with Mr. John McCulloch from the 1860s, and they were growing wine in the Darling River in western New South Wales in the 1860s. So he was French vigneron, and they cleared all of this land to grow 500 different species of exotic fruit trees and vineyards. There was that period. It's still scenic, despite the development of the horticulture and the farming. I've given different walks, and this is a little handout I give on the walks. You get the ferry here, and we go across here, and then walk through here and come back to Church Point as a circuit. And then there's a whole history of the different land grants, and I won't go into every one of them tonight, because I'd like to, but I know that you'll never get home. But they're essentially mostly 19th century, except for Scotland Island, which is 18th century, because 1796, Andrew Thompson was operating on the island, but he wasn't living there. I don't think he ever lived there. He lived in Windsor, and he had something like 20 different properties in the Sydney Basin. He was the magistrate at Windsor, ex-convict friend of Governor Macquarie. So they're both Scottish, and so that's why it's called Scotland Island, because Pittwater reminded him of a loch, but it had too many trees. You know, you just need heather, so you've got to cut them down. So maybe that's what everyone's doing. They're returning it to the image of Scotland. But so there was shipbuilding here, there was salt works, there's timber getting. There's a lot of raping of the middens for lime to go to Sydney. There was a lot of cutting down of the trees for timber for Sydney to go to the bakers for ovens and a source of firewood. And then you get people settling and then dealing in property and selling and on-selling it. And we don't need, but it's broken up. Essentially, you can sort of read the subdivision as if you would look at any other place in Australia like Darwin, or you can see how it's been divided up, and you can see how there's been deals made, and then it's been broken down and subdivided. And I don't need to get into the details, but it is fascinating. And this is the sort of rocky Point Peninsula between Elvina Bay and Lovett Bay and Scotland Island over here. And Mr. William Sharve, 1884, and he's just starting his orchard. Yeah, he had 55 acres and he cleared the lot. And if I showed you photographs, and I'll show you a photograph from the 1940, you'd be aghast, because at the moment now it all looks like it's indigenous bushland. So this is the Oliver's farm, and they had a track that went round on this contour down to a stone jetty that went into the water at low tide, and they offloaded animals and things. Now, the scenic reaches its zenith in 1894. Another Frenchman called Eccleston Dufar, in the establishment of the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. And he's given it an Aboriginal name, so he thought, but it's completely fake. It doesn't exist. And I've said this before publicly, and then I got the Guringai people who are north of Newcastle ring me up and say, "You're absolutely right. It's about time someone exposed these people." You know, I've said to the national parks they should change the name, and they've agreed to it, but they haven't done it yet. And the Guringai Council should also change its name, because Eccleston lived in the Guringai Council. He was a part surveyor in the Lands Department of New South Wales, and he wanted to conserve more areas of Indigenous bushland. And he's very keen on the Blue Mountains and also more areas around Sydney. And if we didn't have people like him, we'd just have wholesale development, you know, medium density, high density, nuclear reactors, the whole thing. So this was the first Chase National Park. Now, the Chase is a French word, and it comes from William Sharp's property with the orchard, and he had 3 points of land, and he built a road that connected the 3 points of land, which is still there, and it was called the Chase. And so that was consumed by the National Park in 1894, and so they made it the Guringai Chase. And his property was called Woodlands. And so, you know, he was also a very empathetic sort of character, but loved his wine, which is good. And then we moved very quickly into still the scenic period, but into the starts of change of ownership of some of the larger estates. So this is Mr. Wood's estate of the 1889, and it was bought by Hall and the house built in 1919. And so I've focused a bit on the different expressions of building for you, because you know, the exposed frame and the timber, the stone base, which I think, and this is a photograph I did for the Heritage Study in 1988, and it looks a bit different now. But the feeling is the same. So it's a sort of Federation period. Mr. Hall was a dentist from North Sydney, and he always wanted to practice agriculture. So they established a drainage system from the waterfall to the west. It came down, and then he cleared a lot of the land and created terraces. This is a 1920s photograph of it, with the building house up here. It's now the youth hostel, which is another story, and it's terraced down here, but there's a lot of clearing that's gone on, right down to where his boat shed was down here, and his own jetty down here. So the clearing was massive, all done by hand. And this is the boat shed. And it's quite ironic that if you go by ferry, you get off at Hall's Wharf, which is not Mr. Hall's Wharf, it's Mr. Sharp's Wharf. But they called it Hall's Wharf, but they just didn't know, because we don't know, you know, the council doesn't know its own history, really. And so it's still called Hall's Wharf, but this is the real Hall's Wharf. It's just that it's too far for the ferry to go around to. So there's a lot to be understood. And then this is another photograph in the 80s looking down at the youth hostel and the way in which the vegetation is now coming back. And when I show the pictures of this all completely cleared all the way down, people just don't believe me. But this is interesting because here you have the Hawkesbury sandstone coming out up here, and then this is the Narrabeen down here into the clay. And then I thought, well, there's been a few characters in Pittwater. Adrian Snodgrass, partnering with Peter Muller, and then working with Bert Reed. And they've all done works within Pittwater, both east and west. And then Bert used to live behind me, and we used to enjoy lots of parties at one stage. There was a lot of drinking of red wine. And then Rudy Karassaman, the poet, bought his house, and then Bert moved on to Canberra. But there is this kind of understanding the scenic and the natural, and the Asian influence of Adrian, and the spiritual, which, so that in architectural terms it's kind of very uplifting and inspirational, and I think that's washed off on a lot of people in this room, I think, subliminally. Then 1890, this is the Witts house in Rocky Point. Again, very similar to Mr. Hall's house with the exposed frame. You could excuse yourself for thinking this is Queensland or possibly Darwin, with the reverse frame, and then the stone base. So there's kind of a language that could be adopted for looking at the Pittwater architecture in a way, I think. And then this is my own house in 1925, which has a stone base and then a veranda on three sides. And I feel today that it's morphing into something else, because we're now in the Anthropocene geological period, when the humans have total input into what's happening to the planet in terms of climate, and it's the first human-influenced geological period. This is Herbert Fitzpatrick's development at Church Point, which burnt down in 1936, and replaced by the Pasadena. Those of you who know the Pasadena, this was much better than the Pasadena. It had its own wonderful dining and cafe and a dance room on the top floor, and a boathouse as well, overlooking to the north. And again, it's sort of the feel very light. 1923, rowing. Even in the 1920s, there was more vegetation. And this is the view from my place, which I've tried to keep that sort of framed view of vegetation, but even that, we've lost some of these trees now. They're actually my neighbours. So in 1921, the island, Scotland Island, was acquired by Herbert Fitzpatrick off Helen Macmillan, another a Scotswoman from Launceston in Tasmania, and a relative of Annabelle and Branko. Annabelle is a Macmillan, and she owned the whole of Scotland Island. But she unfortunately died at sea, travelling to England in the Bay of Bengal, and was buried in the Bay of Bengal. And Mr. Fitzpatrick from Manly saw the opportunity of purchasing the island for a song, and so he burnt it down to survey it, so he could see everything. And then it subdivided it into this enormous quantity. So Helen Macmillan's subdivision, which I probably should show you, but we could spend a whole lecture on Scotland Island. The lots were 2 acres, and now they've got subdivided down into halves of that, and even less than half. And it's creating suburbia, and it's never going to go back unless we burn it down again, which might be a good idea. This is Catherine Benz, who's the granddaughter of Bungaree. She married Joseph Benz, who's a Belgian man, and they took up residence in Scotland Island, and the rest is kind of history. Her relative thinks that she's Darug, but she's in fact Darkinjung, across the river, and she's Kamilaroi Darkinjung. And they have strong song lines down to this place from northwestern New South Wales. And she was always described as a interestingly dark complexioned woman. No one ever said that she was Aboriginal because she was married to an Austrian. So all of the women in the family seem to have a preference for European men for some reason. So it's intriguing. But that's another story. This is a 1940 photograph of that part of the western part of the shores, and Rick and Karen's place is down here. This is Joseph Carrio's land. This is the 3 points of William Sharve. And so he built a house for both of his daughters on each point when they got married. But he had, in fact, 10 children and 4 daughters. And the other daughters he didn't have to build for because they were taken away to the mainland. And so he just let the husbands deal with that. And then this is Mr. Hall's land here. And then it joins into Mr. Williams' land here, which is set up as another exotic orchard. Mr. Williams was the son of a missionary from the South Seas, from the South Pacific. And he was interested in exotic fruit trees, and he planted a lot of them. And he had like a boarding house. We're moving on to what is now Trincomalee, which was originally the Red House on Rocky Point. So these are all the Western Shores places. Mr. Williams' building called Rama, which is a place that it was an early tourist development, and you could have luxuriant tropical fruit and a wonderful view of Pittwater with a tower. So this is now called Trincomalee because it was originally Arturio Stefano. He imagined that he was an Italian opera singer, and he built himself a singing studio and had lots of soiree evenings and invited a lot of Sydney painters, and there was a lot of 4-day parties happening here. And finally ended up being bought by J.J. Smith, who was the part director of, managing director of Mark Foy's. He called it Trincomalee because from that point of land you could have 3 different vistas, as the same as in Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. His granddaughter was Juanita, is infamous for going against the developers in King's Cross and losing her life over it. I don't know who planted the bunya pine, but that's about 1909. Most bunya pines come from about 1909 to 12. I could tell you all about the evolution of the bunya pine if you want. It was first discovered in 1846 by Europeans, but it's been known by Indigenous people for a long time. They had every 3 years they had the Bunya Festival in the Bunya Mountains. They all came from everywhere to go there. And then they went on to Fraser Island after that. And then they traded in goods and stone axes and all sorts of things. And it's named after the man who went there to collect the seed, John Bidwell. So it's called Orocaria bidwellii. And John Bidwell wrote a letter to Mr. MacArthur, who he got the seed for. He was the gardener for John MacArthur in Camden Park. And he said, only lost 3 men to spearing, but acquired the seed you required. So the Aboriginal community, it's a sacred spot, so that wasn't a good thing. They took a long while to work out how to propagate it, and so it didn't become really on the market until the early 1900s. It's a marker of a Federation period. Oh, this is Rama, Mr. Williams's property in Morning Bay. It was also called Towler's Bay up until quite recently. Its original name was Morning. In 1876, the surveyor named the 3 bays: Morning Bay, Evening Bay and Night Bay. Evening Bay was Lovett Bay and Night Bay was Elvina Bay. And I don't think anyone stomached that very well, so the locals just changed it to whatever they wanted it to be. And of course, it became Towler's Bay because Mr. Toller lived, but if you mispronounce Toller, you can say Towler, as we do in Australia. So Mr. Towler's Bay. It's now been renamed Morning Bay. So look out, love it. But this is the sort of guest house up on and it was demolished by the new national parks in 1975, who were kind of nature fascists, and still are, and had lots of exotic trees and lots of all these exotic fruiting trees from the South Pacific. So it was an early resort and had this long jetty coming into the bay. And other people capitalised that, such as Alan Grosvenor, a developer from Mossman and a builder. And this is his painting that he did in 1961 of his house, just below Rama, and after the national parks demolished Rama. They left a part of the outbuildings for use by the national parks employees, but that's recently been demolished. And this building has been left to be quite derelict. And I was interested because I was visiting a friend of mine in Cooma one year, and he said, you should go down to the gallery in Cooma because there's a whole lot of pictures of Pittwater in there. And I said, oh, that's strange. So I went down there, and it's all Alan Grosvenor. And Alan Grosvenor got resumed by the then Rann Labor government, and they used this building as, Neville Rann used this building as for his own uses. And it has all sorts of different stories associated with it as a place to keep the Petrovs when they defected from Russia. And there's a whole, it's not been completely verified, but there's a whole lot of, and it's still there as a ruin, as many of us know, but not many people know about it. He had 2 aquatic cars, and these are the garage, and they go out and he'd drive to Church Point across in the water. So this is a bit of suburbia in the bush. So amazing.
But you know what happened, Craig?
What?
After that house was sort of let go to ruin, which was its best condition, I reckon, it became very apparent that Grosvenor had put the back of those buildings, that is the south side of those buildings, right across the Aboriginal track.
Oh, right.
That linked along Morning Bay and then down across
crossing
the water.
point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting was that maybe 15 years ago now, the Metropolitan Lands Council, Aboriginal Lands Council, was able to retrieve from Europe the remains of many of the Aboriginal people who were just
That's right.
killed and taken away and sent to museums in Europe and were never returned to country or buried properly, just total disrespect.
And still have it.
They brought them back, and the Metropolitan Lands Council reburied them, put them into country again. Fantastic thing to do. But where did they do it? They did it right there, behind the house,
This
left-hand side, up
This
the
way,
hill a
this
little
way.
bit, and was used down over Longnose and to the northeast for the rising sun.
Except that it's interesting.
They knew where the track was, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting. But these were the Guringai.
And even the Land Council got it wrong, because they thought it was Ku-ring-gai. But they're Guringai from north of Newcastle. They're not buried in their country.
Ah, well, you know.
And that's a bureaucratic blunder.
Well, you know, the bloke who runs
And
it.
the Guringai, I speak to the Guringai people regularly because they said, thank goodness you have said something, because it's true. You know, repatriation is good, but it'd be nice if they were in their country. And all of the existing Guringai are very angry.
But this was even irrespective of the fact that they didn't come from this country. They picked the right place.
Yeah. Well,
They picked a brilliant place for it. Right?
Yeah, because they would know.
They knew.
Yeah.
And this is Dorothy McKellar's house of 1925. It's been attributed to Wilson, Neve and Berry, and particularly Hardy Wilson, but I don't think it is. And I said that publicly too. I think it's John D. Moore. It's got nothing to do with the proportions of Hardy Wilson. At the time this was built, Hardy Wilson was living in Tasmania and given up architecture. And John D. Moore had just come back from America and was working in the office of Wilson, Neve and Berry. And so you can pick the proportions. But that's, you know, that's my take on it.
But there's something highly symbolic about that building because they cleared it, or did they? Was it them? I think it probably was. They cleared it, and they effectively, symbolically placed a roof there and lifted it on these columns which are turned out to be exactly the same size now as the forest
As the trees.
as the trees. So it has a sort of a strange belongingness about it. I mean, John B. Moore was a smart guy, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And his son David, of course, was our greatest photographer.
Yeah.
The Malloy house that Rick did, but we modified it a bit later. It was just around in the bay. And then the Cario land, the Portuguese land, because Cario married one of the Oliver girls and got this land. And this is where Richard and Karen are. But this is, again, about 1920s or 30s, I think. But the house, I think, is 1919. And then we've always had this discussion, and I was interested in that it's got the terracing for the horticulture that happened right throughout Pittwater. And then this is Shangri-La, which is, I don't really know who built the first house, but it was Dr. Fraser who rented it and then eventually bought it. And then a relative of mine bought it off him. It typifies the kind of approach to terracing the land in Pittwater, particularly the Narrabeen, in order to grow things. And then the view from above, and this is now Richard and Karen's place, but it's a bit different, as it was in the 1950s. And that was the manager's house, which is what Richard has acquired, to Dr. Fraser. And Dr. Fraser was Dorothy McKellar's doctor, and she had eyes on him, and he wasn't interested in her, much to her regret. There's a concrete path that linked to the two back doors, and I don't know what went on. Well, no, he was considerably older actually, but anyway. Yeah. And then a more contemporary view of Richard and Karen's house, and then I thought to finish on there's people in there that are making music, and that's a good thing for Pittwater. And I'm going to finish it there.
But that's a very aesthetic strand that you've created, that continuity between all these houses.
Yeah.
They do hang together.
Yeah.
And
I think there's that opportunity for a Pittwater,
totally.
like you're saying, a Pittwater boat and a Pittwater house.
Yeah.
It relates to the
Yeah.
place.
The council will never get that, unfortunately. But I think you're quite right about that. Craig and I have spoken at a whole lot of different public meetings to do with the way this whole peninsula from Manly to beautiful Barrenjoey is being just hacked up, and how each of these little tiny places like Mona Vale, Avalon, Newport, blah blah blah, all have a particular quality about them, and the council is talking about putting extra residents in there, and they don't know what it is in the basic land form of each of those places, which must be respected before you start to thread in, housing 2, 3 and 4 stories max with gardens in between. If they're good enough to do it that way.
Most of them were wetlands, weren't they?
Well, that's exactly right. So they've got to retrieve the wetlands, and then the catchment lines that come into them.
Would have been very productive places.
That's right. And that should be done for every one of those.
So they could all be community gardens, and you just build a bit off on the slopes.
And then the residencies come as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
You'd think it would be common sense, but there's very little of that in the councils.
Thank you guys so much for your presence tonight, and really wonderful that you could be here, and thank you. And anyone who would like to stick around, I'm sure Craig will enjoy talking about some more about Pittwater.
Hey Craig, whereabouts are the other currycomb trees in Pittwater other than Lovitz and Cargo?
Well, they're mainly they're going from Lovitz up.
We've got 2 in our place.
Ryan's got 3.
Oh, 3,
yeah. 2 or 3, yeah. No. On the over in Frog Hollow, there's some beauties. all those houses are built on middens, and there's a big one behind one of the houses next to Andrew, and then there's another one going up that creek line, and then so that's starting to pick up a song line going up into the northwest. I've been told there's more over at Newport, Bilgola, but they've all gone through residential development. People have a memory of that. So that's kind of a memory of the old rainforest. It's a rainforest tree that survived.
But they're from the desert, aren't they? Aren't they from the middle? And
Well, no, the whole of Australia was rainforest 300 odd million years ago. So that the rainforest are areas that have they're remnant communities that have had to survive. And so the eucalypts have come in and taken over. The eucalypts started in Western Australia and moved across, and then the acacias came in. So the eucalypts are very advantageous, and they can adapt very quickly. But the rainforest, so that even a lot of people, there's a strong memory of of the old rainforest, which are now the coal measures. So for some reason, the Currajongs have survived pretty well, almost as long. Not as long as some of the rainforest trees, like the myrtle. The myrtle, which is now mostly in Tasmania, but it grows up in Barrington Tops, and it used to be prolific around Melbourne as well. But so things have changed with climate change and so forth. So we have a lot to deal with in the future. But the Currajongs are pretty tough.
So are they remnant or been planted?
They've all been planted. It's a deliberate.
To mark waterfall or...
It marks safe passage, safe water, good camping spot. Yeah.
So like Ryan's would be because of the walk up to it.
I don't really know. I think it's probably just a good spot.
there's the summer and the winter spots, like Albina's definitely, Rock Hollow is definitely the summer spot.
Summer spot, yeah.
And
No, I
Ryan's
think
is definitely
I think that's about water. There's another one on the track, on the Chase. I don't know if you've seen the one on the Chase. And it's in a very dry spot, but there's a spring there. And you can tell that by the turpentine trees that are growing. There's a spring that then runs down to Outer Lovett. And there's a very old house there, which is built in 1856, which is now in the National Park. And you can walk past it and not realise it's there, because the turpentines have grown through it. And there's a big Currajong there, and that's saying good water. There's another tree on Scotland Island which is very old, which is Backhausia myrtifolia, growing on we carbon dated the midden at 3,500 years. And so it's a big tree. But I think that the Currajong that I showed you, or the remnant Currajong, but it's coming back. It's about 30 metres high. That's the biggest one I've ever seen in the east coast of Australia. I've plotted them over the whole east coast of Australia. People did tell me about there was so many Currajongs over near where the Royal Motor Yacht Squadron is, and over in Newport, so that they're gone, and then I can spot some from photographs, but not all. I've got a good friend who's a botanist and an ecologist in Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and he did the study of the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, inverted commas, and I said, you didn't put the Currajongs in, and he went, what Currajongs? And he said, oh, you missed something. And then he said, you just want to believe it. But then I've had so much information from people everywhere. I had a good friend who's an archaeologist who said, oh, I know where there's some up the north coast. I know where there's some on the south coast. And I've since found so much information. And then I was talking to Bruce Pascoe. Bruce Pascoe said that he's planted an avenue of Kurrajong trees on his property down in Malakuta, as he said, in the way that the old people always did. So, you know, it's an old tradition. But I've got innumerable examples of it now. There's Kurrajongs going right up to the top of Mount Kosciuszko to get the moths, you know, in the moth hunting period. So John Blay, who wrote the book about that passage, he said he bought all these topographical maps and he couldn't work out how to get there. And then all of a sudden he realised that there was a Kurrajong tree at every turn of direction. So it was the female spirit telling him which way to go. And then he got it. And a lot of the trees are blazed with a kind of callographic symbol which represents a particular family in the clan group of where the tree is planted. And if you want to use parts of the tree, and every part is usable to Aboriginal people, not just for fishing line, but you can eat, you could make a narcotic drink, you can make canoes, you can do all sorts of things with it. It's like a supermarket tree, you know, and then you have to negotiate with everyone who knows what the symbol is. That's that family. You have to negotiate if you want to use part of the tree. And usually, if you negotiate with the family, you get permission to use it. That's the Aboriginal way. Whereas the council here just cut it down with a chainsaw. But it's coming back. Some things you can't stop, which is great.